Hello, welcome to this webinar. I'm Professor Chiyuki Aoi of GRASP and Director of Strategic Communications, Education and Research Unit here at GRASP. I'm greatly pleased to present this seminar on G7 in Hiroshima, a policymakers assessment today, as the sixth SCERU seminar. Today, our guest lecturer is Mr. Noriyuki Shikata, Cabinet Secretary for Public Affairs, Prime Minister's Office of Japan, who will share his views on an assessment of the achievements of the G7 Summit in Hiroshima, held on 19th and 21st May 2023, and Japan's role as chair of the meeting. Already much has been discussed on the focus and achievement of the G7, but let me reread the passage contained in the final communique of the G7, which stated that we welcome and further encourage efforts made by the private sector, universities and think tanks, which contribute to realizing free and open Indo-Pacific. It is in this spirit that SCERU, as the unique center of strategic communications operating in the Indo-Pacific, will endeavor to contribute to debates on the free and open Indo-Pacific. Mr. Noriyuki Shikata was appointed Cabinet Secretary for Public Affairs under Prime Minister Fumio Kishida in October 2021. Most recently, he was Assistant Minister, Director General, Economic Affairs Bureau of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MOFA. Among his other previous appointments are Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary, Deputy Chief of Mission, Embassy of Japan in China, Deputy Director General, Asian and Oceanian Affairs Bureau, MOFA, Political Minister, Embassy of Japan in the UK, and Director of Global Communications, Prime Minister's Office. He is also a winner of the Gold Standard Award for Political Communications in 2011. Let me first make a little household announcement. So for audiences on site, I will open the floor to questions and I will point to you. So and there will be assistant who will be bringing the microphone to you. And those who are listening online, please write your questions to Q&A section, not chat section. Okay, today, Dean Keisuke Ida of GRASP will offer a few words before giving the floor to Mr. Shikata.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to today's event. Thank you, Aoi-sensei, for introduction. So it is with a great pleasure that I announce today's SCERU seminar. In case you don't know, we created this great research unit in recognition of the fact that communication, especially strategic communication, is increasingly important in foreign and security affairs, especially in this age of disinformation, post-truth, and cyber attacks, and all sorts of information manipulation from various actors in the world. Accurate information based on trustworthy strategy and strategic communication is indispensable for sound policy. And therefore, this research unit called SCERU is engaged in both research and education to advance these causes. Today, we have someone who's most qualified to speak about this topic. Mr. Shikata, as introduced by Aoi-sensei, he graduated from Kyoto University and entered the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1986. He went to Harvard and got his master's degree from Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And then he occupied many important positions in both MOFA and Prime Minister's Office, again introduced by Professor Aoi. In terms of strategic communication, he was assistant press secretary from 2006 to 2007, 国際報道官 in Japanese. And also he was director of communication, global communication in Prime Minister's office from 2010 to 2012. He's currently Cabinet Secretary of Public Affairs. Clearly the key position for strategic communication in the whole Japanese government. So I hear that he's going to talk about G7 in Hiroshima today. You know, we have this trilogy on G7, just in case you don't know. We invited Dr. Okonjo Iweala after attending the outreach session in Hiroshima, and she came to us and gave a sort of insider's view on G7 as well as trade. And then last week we had someone from Cambridge University to speak about his assessment of G7. So today we have to conclude this trilogy, we have insiders' assessment of G7, which will culminate in our series of events on G7. So we are certainly looking forward to hearing his opinion. A lot of people say that this G7 summit was one of the most successful in recent memory. So is that correct? And we'll hear a lot on this from him, hopefully. And also we have a discussant, online, sorry. Dr. Shetler-Jones, who has been with us for some time to help us out with this research unit. So thank you very much for his participation. Unfortunately, I have a busy schedule today, so I cannot stay until the end, but I hope that you have a great seminar today. So thank you.
Mr. Shikata, floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a very kind introduction by Professor Aoi and Professor Ida. It's a great pleasure for me to come back to this public policy school of the University of Tokyo. And I'm very much impressed by Aoi's efforts to discuss the importance of strategic communications. And today I will be discussing G7 Hiroshima Summit in relation to the kind of the Prime Minister Kishida's the domestic and diplomatic policy issues. So what kind of linkages are there between the Japanese government's policy approaches under Prime Minister Kishida and G7 summit in terms of the linkages and what kind of preparation has been conducted? And for those of you who have been kind of studying the policy process, public policy making, and communications issues, I hope I would be able to contribute a bit in terms of kind of broad overview of policy making process of the Japanese government and G7 governments. So let me just get started with the slide. And I really appreciate the forthcoming feedback comments from Dr. Shetler-Jones. We are connected by Twitter, even if we are far apart. So he kind of retweets some of my tweets, and that's wonderful. I guess the strategic communications in building or deepening our strategic partnership among like-minded countries and partners. So let me just move on to G7 Hiroshima Summit, the overview. Next slide. As you are aware, the G7 participants, although we call them G7, actually it's not only 7 countries, because European Council and European Commission are also represented. And in terms of this order of participants, this is in terms of the forthcoming host or the chair of G7 presidency. So next year, G7 will be hosted by Italy, and to be followed by Canada, France, and US. As you are aware, we in Japan, we are hosting in total 15 ministerial meetings. So until the end of this year, our presidency of G7 continues. So when there are kind of new developments, for example, on Ukraine situation, Japan could convene kind of extraordinary summit meeting, including online meetings. Invited countries, G7 chair can basically decide whom to invite, of course, in close coordination with other G7 members. So as you see, we have Japan, Prime Minister Kishida has invited the members, the countries from the Indo-Pacific region, such as Australia, India, Indonesia, Korea, and Vietnam. But also the chair of the regional groups, such as African Union or Pacific Islands Forum, G20, and ASEAN. And also there are invited international organizations, which is listed here. And I understood that DG Okonjo came to this university for her talks. Next, please. So when we were preparing for G7 Hiroshima Summit, there are 2 major perspectives, or maybe Professor Aoi may regard this as narratives. So 2 major points. And one is this terminology of free and open international order based on the rule of law. And this is something Prime Minister Kishida has been emphasizing and tried to build the kind of consensus, not only among G7 countries, but also the next point, the global South countries. And of course, it's hard to define the global South. Usually we mean developing countries or emerging economies. But as I mentioned, invited countries many of them belong to global South. And when Prime Minister Kishida went to India in March, he had in his mind kind of attaching so much importance to collaboration between G7 and G20 summits. Prime Minister Modi will be hosting a G20 summit in India in September. And so this is very important kind of outreach before Hiroshima Summit to go to India. Of course, that was followed by his trip to Ukraine, and Poland in March. And during the Golden Week, he was visiting 4 African countries, Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, and Mozambique, dropping by at Singapore. And then immediately after, he visited South Korea. So lots of outreach efforts in terms of diplomatic engagements beyond the G7 countries. Of course, in January, Prime Minister Kishida traveled first to France, Italy, UK, Canada, and the United States. So across the world, the globe in 1 week, pretty hectic. But this was very important for bilateral engagement. Before he's hosting a G7 summit in Hiroshima, and he was engaging with some of the new prime ministers from Italy or the UK, Prime Minister Meloni or Prime Minister Sunak. Next one is a map from in terms of ministerial meetings, and we have already hosted a number of ministerial meetings, but there are still remaining ones to be held toward the end of this year. And so, in a sense, there are kind of concurrent processes of discussion among G7 members. Take an example of, say, clean energy or environment. There was one ministerial meeting in Sapporo in mid-April, and ministerial meeting on climate, energy, and the environment. So some of the results of ministerial meetings fed into the G7 Hiroshima Summit. The same thing about, for example, digital ministers meeting that was held in Takasaki, Gunma, digital and tech ministers meeting. And they talked about issues like responsible AI, or including ChatGPT related issues, how we could come up with the international rules governing the new technologies, for example. Next, please. So when I look back the result of G7 Hiroshima Summit, this is the major kind of outcomes from the summit. Number one is upholding and reinforcing the free and open international order based on the rule of law. And of course, major focus was how we could support Ukraine and how we could continue our strong sanctions against Russia. And also, PM Kishida wanted to include the discussion on the Indo-Pacific. Of course, Japan has been promoting free and open Indo-Pacific, so-called POIP, from the days of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And also this summit included robust discussion on economic security. Second pillar is, as I mentioned, outreach to international partners, including the Global South. And on this issue, when we choose the agenda items in terms of expanded sessions with the participation of invited countries, we were discussing issues like food security or global health, energy, and food-related issues. And they are common agenda. And when we visited the 4 African countries, most of them have been suffering, from energy or food security issues, shortages, or price hikes. And some of them in Africa, or many of them, have been suffering, from accumulation of debt, under the COVID, and also hit by energy and food crisis. So for the G7 to be significant for the international community, we need to address the real issues facing the global South countries. And the third pillar is this disarmament and non-proliferation efforts. And of course, PM Kishida has been attaching so much importance as the member of parliament from Hiroshima, and he has been committed himself to pursue the world without the nuclear weapons. And the visit by those invited leaders to Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum has sent a very strong message across the world. Next, please. So I will just touch upon some of the issues that was taken up, support for Ukraine, and also sanctions against Russia. One major issue that we face in terms of implementing sanctions against Russia is the so-called leakages. So even if G7 members are implementing strong sanctions against Russia, if there are loopholes or leakages, or third countries supporting Russia's military capability, that would undermine our sanctions efforts. So that's one issue which we will continue to discuss. And of course, we need to continue to support Ukraine, including the post-war reconstruction inside. Number two, disarmament and non-proliferation issues is something I touched upon. And the third one is economic resilience and economic security. And economic security agenda item is something which Prime Minister Kishida decided to take up as major agenda item. And there was a standalone statement on this subject. As you are aware, under Prime Minister Kishida, there is a new cabinet minister in charge of economic security, Madam Takaichi. And Japan has been stepping up its own efforts, including introduction of new legislation governing economic security issues. And so there are a number of issues surrounding economic security, including how we could coordinate the issues such as economic coercion. Next slide addresses issues that would be of interest to global South countries, including how we could accelerate our efforts on green transformation. Japan has been also tackling this issue, and Japan has been also making the case for supporting green transition in developing countries. And from the Japanese perspective, we have been supporting kind of customized roadmap for energy transition in Southeast Asia or India, among others. Food security issue is something I touched upon, and there was a document named Hiroshima Action Statement for Resilient Global Food Security, which has been joined by invited guests. And the last point is financing for quality infrastructure. And Japan has been making the case that we should make sure that the development finance should be transparent, and they should not lead to the kind of debt trap. And the one specific example that we are working on now is the Sri Lanka's the issue. And so there has been collaboration among Japan, France, partly because of Paris Club, and India, to support debt reorganization of Sri Lankan government. And Sri Lankan president was visiting Japan, and we have been supporting Sri Lanka on this issue. Also, there is a relatively new initiative called the PGII, Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which I will touch upon later. Next slide is the overview of G7 Communique as related to support for Ukraine and sanctions against Russia, and on the right hand, Japan's further support for Ukraine, including financial support, material support, humanitarian, refugee, and reconstruction support. Japan is focused on some sectors in Ukraine, such as energy sector. You may remember PM Kishida's visit to Bucha in Ukraine, and Japan or JICA has been supporting delivery of power generators. We were concerned about possible kind of power shortages or severe winters. So energy sector is one sector which Ukrainian side is also expecting Japan to support. But there are other sectors such as agriculture and also demining. So when PM Kishida visited Phnom Penh, Cambodia, he was engaging with Prime Minister Hun Sen, and there was agreement that with the experience of demining efforts in Cambodia, which Japan has been supporting since the early 90s, Ukrainian experts could be, coming to Cambodia, and Japan would support the kind of transfer of demining solutions to Ukrainian side. Next, please. And as you all know, President Zelensky's visit to Hiroshima caught a very, wide international attention. And there are three aspects to his visit. Number one is President Zelenskyy could engage with G7 leaders. Of course, he was visiting some European countries before he came to Hiroshima. And also, by visiting together, Prime Minister Kishida and President Zelenskyy visiting Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, this sent a strong message for our pursuit of the world without nuclear weapons, or strongly urging Russia, not to threaten, the use of nuclear weapons, and also this Hiroshima Summit became important occasions for President Zelenskyy to engage with other invited leaders, such as India and Indonesia. Next slide is just one example of message from Prime Minister Kishida on Ukraine. This is coming from 1 year ago. And this is a message from Prime Minister Kishida to the Japanese public. And we translated, this message. And so from the outset, PM Kishida has been intentionally sending out a very strong message on the issue of Ukraine. And next, please. And this is the slide coming from his visit to Ukraine in March. I mentioned, some of the sectors, such as power sector, mine clearance, agriculture, energy sector, among others. And we are supporting the provision of defense equipment through NATO Trust Fund. Next, please. Since assuming the office of Prime Minister, PM Kishida has been coming up with the efforts on this nuclear disarmament. As I said, he has been attaching so much importance to this issue. And next slide covers a summary of his Hiroshima Action Plan, which he announced last year. And he was working on preparing for Hiroshima Summit in terms of coming up with standalone documents on the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, as I mentioned. So some of the elements from proposed Hiroshima Action Plan is included in the document released, from the Hiroshima Summit. Next, please. This is about economic resilience and economic security. The right hand touches upon some of the major issues we are tackling in terms of resilient supply chain, critical infrastructure, as I mentioned, economic coercion, and preventing leakage of critical and emerging technologies, sensitive technologies, to countries like Russia. Next, please. So this is Japan's stance on economic security, and there are lots of the kind of overlaps or common approaches among G7 countries. And as we have been implementing sanctions against Russia, in a sense, we have been coordinating our sanctions measures in relation to G7 process. And this all started, from late February of last year. Next one is clean energy issues, and this is this G7 released a clean energy economic action plan. And I'm, I guess, running out of time, so I will just skip the detailed explanations, but if there are some questions related to the issues that I mentioned, I guess I should just ask Professor Aoi to lead us to question and answer sessions later on. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Shikata. We have, this is indeed, strategic communications in action in the diplomatic stage. So it was really eye-opening to listen to your summary of the arguments. Today, we have a discussant online who is Dr. Philip Shetler-Jones, who is a crisis management expert and officer at the ESIWA program of the European Union. ESIWA is Enhancing Security in and with Asia program that is a sort of flagship program for the EU to engage with Indo-Pacific region. And of course, Dr. Philip Shetler-Jones is an expert on Indo-Pacific. So we are very glad to have you, Philip. So may I give the floor floor to you to ask some concentrated questions to the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Aoi. I hope you can hear me fine in Tokyo. I'm sorry not to be there. It's very nice to see Shikata-san. Look forward to catching up soon in Japan. I'm going to keep my response fairly short so that we might have some time for the participants there to do some Q&A. So I step back a bit from the detail and the outcomes of the G7 to think about some of the intangible aspects from a strategic communication point of view. So one point of view is that this G7 meeting needed to do two things, I think, both in terms of the G7 as an institution and also in terms of Japan presenting itself and its role in the world. One of those things was the G7 needed to demonstrate it was able to adapt to the world as it is now, which is unfortunately a world which is not very kind to institutions like the G7, because it's a world experiencing war among great powers. It's experiencing hot war, but also an incipient Cold War, trade wars, and other kinds of competition and confrontation. And that is not the ideal situation for a body like the G7, which is, after all, a bit different from the United Nations in its constitutional and legal basis, and so open always to questions about its legitimacy. So I think that's the second thing this G7 needed to do, was to demonstrate legitimacy for the G7 itself and for Japan and its role as a leader in the G7 and more broadly. Obviously, one of the characteristics of G7, which was very much on show, was it's like-minded on questions about how to respond to what's happening now in the war going on between Russia and Ukraine. It's obviously used to be the G8, including Russia. And so that shows how far we have come, that one of the major themes of this G7 was uniting and solidarity in support of Ukraine. I think the other thing that puts this G7 on the spot is, I think there is a rather widespread view that the institutions of global governance that should be doing some of this job that the G7 is taking on, like the United Nations, are underperforming. And obviously part of the reason for that is this division among the UN Security Council members and great powers. And the other problem the G7 has is that this is a time when, as a body of economic players, it's accountable to quite a difficult agenda as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Many countries are experiencing stresses, were mentioned, about food security, energy prices, and other kinds of economic growth and recovery. And of course, there are other contending approaches to world leadership, especially when it comes to this issue of the Global South. So Prime Minister Modi of India has held a Global South conference, and People's Republic of China has also made a message of a leadership of the Global South. So in a way, this Global South idea, which is, depending who you ask, a more or less comfortable framing, is kind of in play among a competing set of leaders. So how well, from that point of view, how well did the G7 do? I think one of the things that was very noticeable was the extent of preparation for this G7. And one aspect of that was officials, including Shikata-san, spending a lot of time talking about the agenda and the arrangements well in advance of the meeting. And of course, the diplomacy that you mentioned as well. Prime Minister Kishida and others traveling around talking about the event in advance. The second was the way that the summit used location. And I noticed in the slide about Hiroshima itself, we are drawn attention to the fact that President Zelenskyy went to Hiroshima. But I thought it was very touching and quite impressive, actually, the way that the other leaders of the G7 and the other invited countries from Global South or from other non-G7 countries all had the opportunity of that very unique experience of visiting Hiroshima and through the visit to the museum, having that really more heartfelt education and reflection about the meaning of nuclear weapons. So I think that this summit was quite special in communicating that kind of intangible effect that only really Japan is imaginable to offer. The third point, I think, is, and this is again one of the things which is in the hands of the chair, the inclusion. And so the inclusion of this many countries from outside the G7 and where they came from, I think was one of the ways it achieved its objectives. And then the final point is, I would say, a sense of confidence that was successfully communicated by the way this conference was handled. So the preparation, the actual on-site organization, which appeared from a distance, at least, I watched it through media, seemed to go flawlessly. And that communicated also a great sort of quality of Japan's role, but also confidence in the idea that multilateral institutions can deliver some kind of effective global governance in this difficult period when leadership, global leadership is very much contested. Institutions like the G7 are very open to criticism as being a Western club or a club which is not representative. And so I think the overall effect was this, on substance, it delivered a content that was principled, responsible, trustworthy, and productive. I mean, the actual G7 statement is terrifically long. I was trying to read it all in preparation for our event today, and I was astonished at how much is in there. But I would say also on a communications level, there were points of style that we should notice. I think that the presentation of the meeting was one of a very cultivated feeling. And the logo I see was mentioned, but all sorts of other sort of cultural and artistic features were there in the way that it was communicated to the world. It was very orderly. As I say, there was this factor of inclusion, which I think goes a long way to deal with the legitimacy question. And then there was this, I would say, heartfelt, intangible aspect of the Hiroshima experience, which is, I think, for anyone who's been there, a unique and unforgettable one. And some of that feeling was, I think, transmitted through the participation of the leaders in events there. So with that, I'd like to call a halt. And I suppose my summing up question would be to Shikata-san is, how much consideration was given to this balance between the conscious, factual outcomes and the other aspect, which is the unconscious, more emotional outcomes of the communication, and whether this was anywhere in your thoughts in the way that you planned and went about the strategic communication of the G7 summit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, for your very insightful comments. And as you pointed out, the choice of the venue was really important. And I felt I was kind of commuting between Grand Prince Hotel, where many of the leaders were staying, to International Media Center, which is a bit, far. But when I go to International Media Center, I felt, that lots of, for example, international journalists, coming to Hiroshima, were also appreciating the culture of Hiroshima, including okonomiyaki and the local Hiroshima sake. And there was a long line in front of Hiroshima oyster joint. And so there was some kind of a local, taste. And many people told me that, it was their first time to come to Hiroshima, and they really enjoyed, like going to, Seto Naikai and beautiful seeing and so forth. And I should also add, that the Mrs. Kishida was hosting the Partners program, and including introduction of Japanese tea ceremony, And so there was, cultural, dimensions, and this is kind of a soft power diplomacy, in my opinion. But also, for example, Prime Minister Modi of India was visiting a newly installed statue of Mr. Gandhi. And so it, of course, this sends out the strong message of kind of peace or non-violence. And so there are different aspects where the leaders were doing their own diplomatic activities, including French airplane that brought President Zelenskyy. And you can imagine, President Macron was very, proud of that flight arriving in Hiroshima. Of course, we were talking about, I was talking with Professor Suzuki about, this decoupling and all those issues. And Professor Suzuki rightly noticed, that Madame von der Leyen was starting to talk about de-risking. And at the end of the day, G7 document included, this concept. So, so there was kind of very serious, aspects of preparing documents. It's, too many pages, probably in somebody's opinion. But also there was cultural elements and emotional, side, which was combined. So maybe, in terms of policy substance, there is too much, but at the same time, we wanted to, especially Prime Minister Kishida wanted to come up with comprehensive G7 Hiroshima Summit. And to achieve that, so many people worked really hard, including the preparation committee of Hiroshima City and the prefecture of Hiroshima. And of course, we need to make sure that the security is well prepared. So you can see many prefectural police people coming to Hiroshima, and so there are many different aspects. One last thing is this logo page 2. You may have noticed this 7 differently colored origami sheets are bound together by a paper clip. And so this is a symbol of unity among G7 members. And we kind of invited these logos from the public. It just so happened the person who designed this logo came from is from Nagasaki, and you could probably see in the page, this one, and I think this logo was liked by many. Thank you. I don't know whether I really answered your question, but yeah.
Well, thank you, Philip, also for sharing with us your observation. Thank you. I'm afraid that the time is up, so I think with this, I think I close the session. Thank you very much for your participation, and let's give Mr. Shikata a loud hand.